G'day. Welcome to Lunch Money, your online and social media home for special situations, workouts and capital raising professionals. I appreciate it's not lunchtime, it's actually past your dinner time, but you'll soon find out why we're broadcasting at this time. Look, I'm a fund manager. I started this Hermes fund nearly 14 years ago, and I want to give you a 90-second snapshot of how you start a finance business. Now, there's a little bit of technical stuff here, so bear with me. You start off, you need to work out where on the risk curve you want to be. And for people listening on the podcast, I've got a graph here. There's a line that rises to the right. So the more risk you take, the more your return is. So more price, higher interest rates, more risk. Now you need then to work out where you want to be. If you're taking on a certain level of risk but not charging enough for it, well, you're going to sell a lot of loans. They're going to be underpriced loans. There'll be a lot of demand, but eventually that'll come to fruition on your book because you've got too much risk for your pricing. If you price yourself above the risk return curve, you're not going to write any loans because people who are at a certain point along the risk axis can easily borrow money cheaper than what you're offering. Now, of course, if your money's not just a commodity and you're adding a lot of value, you might be able to get away with that. There's no doubt about that. You can be above the yield curve if you're adding a certain amount of value beyond the commodity price. But if that's not the case, you need to do something else. If you're not going to be providing value at above the commodity price of money, you either need to get yourself back on the yield curve, or you have to turn your fund into a Ponzi scheme, or you have to lie to your investors and face the consequences down the track. Now, that's just apropos of nothing. I'm now going to change topics. Today, we're looking at the rise and fall of Greensill Capital. Greensill was a pioneering supply chain finance firm, and at one time very successful. It sort of came out around the time of the GFC. Its founder was Lex Greensill. Greensill rose so rapidly that the first time I heard of it, in sort of around 2015-16, Lex Greensill was already a billionaire. Here are some of the headlines from the good times. Unlikely way 3 Bundaberg farmers made $1.2 billion. There's a picture of Lex Greensill on his farm in Bundaberg wearing high vis and a hat. Lex Greensill receives top university award. He was the entrepreneur of the year. He received a commander of the British Empire from Prince Charles. That's how pioneering his finance business was and how successful he was considered to be. But as spectacular as the rise of Greensill was, its fall was even more spectacular. And here are some headlines from when things turned very, very sour indeed. Greensill claims hit $4.9 billion. IAG discloses $7 billion in legal claims after Greensill's collapse. This thing was enormous. Greensill legacy rocks global markets. Australian billionaire Lex Greensill beguiled the world's rich and powerful. Telstra and UGL pulled out of their arrangements, of course. Greensill traded whilst insolvent, say liquidators. ATO takes a close look at Greensill. It just went from bad to worse. Well, all of this was captured in a wonderful book called Pyramid of Lies that I've just finished reading. The author of that book is Duncan Mavin. I reached out to Duncan and he's very generously agreed to come on Lunch Money. Duncan is a senior assignment editor and columnist for the Washington Post in London, focusing on global business and economics. Duncan spent a decade as a chartered accountant in the city of Toronto. So for accountants, there's hope for you yet. He became a financial reporter and foreign correspondent. He's been a reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal based in Hong Kong and London. His writing also appeared in Barron's, Financial News and Bloomberg. He lives with his wife and 3 sons in the UK and is a long-suffering fan of Sunderland Football Club. And I'm very pleased to say he is here with us right now. Welcome, Duncan.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
And what did you think of my little risk analysis there in terms of?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. I think, it seems pretty basic, but it's probably a tool that a lot of people should use. A lot of people should be thinking about loans that way. It's very relevant to Greensill Capital, I think, because one of the things that I heard over and over again about Greensill was look at the returns, these steady returns that are happening. You kind of look at the loans and go, but that's the problem. They shouldn't be happening.
Well, I've got to tell you what happens in finance, certainly in Australia, and I've got no doubt everywhere, is people like me, they decide they're going to set up a fund, and they go to investors and they say, listen, I've got this great idea. We're going to make above normal returns, and there's going to be less risk. So there's going to be no risk. You're going to be making above normal returns. Give me all your money. And then, of course, what happens is they raise money. If they're lucky enough, they raise the money, and then there's no deals, because you can't write deals that you can't get the returns if you're taking the low risk profile. So then you've either got to start writing, taking on more risk, or something's got to give.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, actually. So I think in the case of Greensill Capital, that's a really good way of looking at it. It's exactly what the promise was: low risk, above normal returns. And then I think one way, there are many different ways to kind of slice and dice what went wrong at Greensill, but one way of looking at it, I think, is exactly as you said. So there are not enough, they can't source loans at the prices they want. And so it all goes wrong, right? It's they have to source loans that are different to the ones they've told the investors are going to get.
It's interesting because I think what we're seeing now in the property market, when interest rates were very low, during COVID and before COVID, everybody's become a lender. I started 14 years ago, but there's just lenders everywhere now, and they set up these property funds, for example, because you can't lose money on property. Impossible. But of course, you can get these fabulous returns. But I think there's going to be a wave of problems in that sector for exactly the same reasons.
Yeah, I mean, another way of looking at it that an investor similar to yourself had told me about when I first started looking at Greensill was, along comes this guy saying, I can give you slightly better than a money market fund, and all you got to do is read this 200-page document that tells you how I'm doing it. And this guy said, straight away, there's the red flag. I'm not reading 200 pages to get slightly better return than a money market fund. I'm not putting my money in. How can it be that complicated? And he was right.
It's interesting though you say that, because I know from my own experience with our fund. I mean, we've been running our fund for 14 years, and it's we've run a successful fund. COVID was not a fun time in my business, but nonetheless, what I found was for the first 5 years, no one would give us any money. But then 5 years seemed to be a magical point where all of a sudden everybody wanted to give us money. But now we never dealt with institutions. We're only dealing with high net worths, and maybe you could call some sort of low-end family offices, I suppose. But it did surprise me how often people wouldn't read stuff. And, luckily it was me, right? But they would just hand over the money, and they put in more and more.
Well, that's also true, I think. So, I mean, that happens over and over and again with Greensill, not just in the funds that are investing in sort of Greensill sourced loans, but also into Greensill itself, right? So there's a bit in the book where I talk about SoftBank putting their money into Greensill, and I've seen their due diligence reports. I know exactly what they did. They spent 8 weeks from start to finish, their entire due diligence. They put $800 million in. 8 weeks to decide I'm putting $800 million in is just staggering. And I think if you speak to people there, I mean, in the end, by the way, they put a lot more than that in, a couple of $1 billion probably they end up losing. But in the end, I think what they did was they're following others, right? So they see that another big investor's already gone in, and so they just kind of, well, they probably did their work. And so now I'm in. And I think that's possibly what you're talking about a little bit, right? Is that once there's a sort of level of credibility or perceived credibility, then, investors tend to, like their guard comes down a little bit. And so they don't ask the questions. They don't read the documents. They just kind of trust the guy that they're giving the money to is a good guy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess it's a little bit like, we're sort of in the small and medium-sized business space. So, someone says, oh, well, Macquarie Bank's loaned the money, they must be okay. Macquarie Bank would have done their homework. Yeah. It's interesting. I've just finished reading Guy Hand's book, The Deal Makers. Great book. And he talks about the level of due diligence that he did with Nomura. I mean, it was incredible when they were buying, chains of retailers. I went to every single store. Okay, well, look, so, you're an accountant, you've got an accountant background. So, for you to get your head around this stuff wasn't necessarily terribly challenging for you personally. But it was, to the lay person, this stuff was very complex. So, as an author, as a writer, I mean, I'm assuming that, your target audience isn't just the people on Wall Street who deal with derivatives and fancy finance products. So you're looking for, for more people to be engaged in your book. How do you make this sort of stuff accessible to readers? I saw the movie The Big Short, which is a great movie, and they have scenes like you've got Margot Robbie in a bubble bath, dumbing down some of the financial concepts. I didn't incur Margot Robbie in your book. So how do you sort of take on that challenge?
Yeah, it's definitely, you're right. It is challenging. I think at the heart of what Greensill does is it's fairly straightforward, but it's sort of deliberately layered with complexity. Lex is a lawyer by training. He's a finance guy. He's deliberately layer upon layer upon layer of complexity and offshore funds and things like that. But at the heart of it, it's fairly simple. So I think what you have to do is kind of try and unpeel those layers a bit. Try and sort of say, there are bits of this you don't need to know to fully understand it. So let's concentrate on the bits you do know. But then I think the other thing that makes something like Greensill an interesting story for me is that the personalities, right? It's actually all about the personalities. And Lex is just a fascinating guy because he, comes from Bundaberg, comes from a farming background, kind of reinvents himself as this, establishment guy who's like connected to pretty much to royalty and certainly British political royalty. And, that in and of itself is just an amazing trajectory. To get from where he was to where he got to is kind of incredible.
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess there's the old saying, you are who you say you are. I don't know if you've heard that one, but if you've got the bravado to pull it off, but it was incredible. I'll tell you what, I spoke, I do know some people in the finance industry in Australia who used to work for Greensill. And I actually approached a few of them to ask them what questions I should put to you, and one of them was he was kind of almost offended actually by your book because he, obviously and to me it was like the charm of this man must have been incredible. That in spite of everything we've seen, he still obviously kept a lot of people in his thrall. Yeah,
I think that's right. He's definitely. Look, he's a really divisive guy, right? So when I first heard about them, start asking, just basically this company comes out of nowhere, suddenly massive multi-billion-dollar company involved in a scandal at a fund manager in the UK. This a few years ago, a company called GAM, an asset manager. And so I knew a little bit about GAM, but I'd never heard of Greensill. So I just started asking around, who is this guy? What's going on? And it's pretty clear straight away that, 4 out of 5 people you speak to say, don't touch the guy with a barge pole.
Wow.
There's some real problems here. But the 5th guy you speak to, oh no, this guy's a genius. He's going to change the world. Everybody who works for him is going to be a billionaire. I mean, it's incredible, right? So I don't know, like, why some people fall for it and some people don't. I can't tell you that. But certainly he's a sort of charismatic sales guy. Definitely somebody who presents himself as a kind of visionary. And so once you've fallen behind that, I guess it's pretty hard to maybe admit you're wrong. I think I can categorically say people like the guy you spoke to are in the wrong at this point. But I think it's probably really hard to acknowledge that, right? To admit, I was wrong for a bunch of years and I thought this guy was going to be a genius, but turns out he's not.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that he's not a genius. Like he's a very smart guy. Maybe
that's fair. There is a certain level of genius in what he achieved.
I mean, my next question is, I've been in this game, in the finance game for 40 years, believe it or not. And I remember when you start in finance, the boss calls you into the office, and I had this boss years ago, and he used to love telling the stories, and there'd be the great legendary frauds. There was one Tonal, which was a a muffler supplier or something, and all the finance companies moved in at night and repossessed the equipment, but everybody owned the same equipment. It was a massive fraud, and you'd hear you'd hear these stories time and again, and then you'd think this will never happen again. Everybody's wise to this stuff, but then a couple of years later there was another one. National Safety Council, same thing. This guy was, he was flying financiers around so they could see their assets, that there were trucks and this sort of thing. And then he would be entertaining them, and then he'd be moving the trucks to another location while they're having lunch or something, and then he'd fly them again. It was just incredible. So, and there was another one more recently, a chap, I think his name was Bill Pappas, and he made off with $500 or $600 million. He's gone to Greece. I don't think they'll ever get him again.
Yeah.
And you think, well, how did they do that? Like, didn't these guys hear the story about Tonal? I mean, how do they keep? When will this end? Why did Lex happen? Haven't people heard the stories?
I know. It is kind of amazing. It keeps happening over and over and over again, as you say. I don't know. Like, the question? One question for me is, does Lex start out knowing he's going to do something wrong, or does he start out planning to do something, the right way, and incrementally things start to go wrong, and he ends up in a bad place? And I think I'd like to believe it's the latter, that he starts out with this idea that he thinks is a good business idea. He's kind of sort of put it together with bits of other people's ideas, starts out in a place where he thinks, well, it's a good idea and can make some money. Turns out he kind of can't make money that way. So he incrementally changes it until, he's miles away from where the starting point was. Now, I'm not absolving him of any kind of criticism or blame, because I think, some people, you or I, might say, hang on a minute, this isn't the plan and it's gone wrong, and so we better stop. And some people just keep digging, thinking they can get out the problem. I think that's, maybe Lex's personality flaw is so much self-belief that when things start to go wrong, rather than sort of say, hey, I've made a bunch of loans here that aren't good, he says, I've made a bunch of loans here, they're not good right now, I'll recover them if I can just grow this business bigger. I'll sort myself out.
Well, it is almost like a Greek tragedy to some extent. He's in, or I don't know, it reminds me of a film noir. You get charmed by the girl, the next thing you've murdered her husband and you're on the run. And then you've got to do bigger and bigger things to sort of, or another metaphor is when you're at the racetrack and you've got to get out, you got to get your money back on the last race in Brisbane. It's just escalating the bets. I just couldn't believe, reading your book, how he went from one financier to the next, SoftBank and then, and Credit Suisse and really, in the end, I mean, it was one bailing out the other in reality, wasn't it?
Yeah. It's just the money just keeps shifting from one place to the next. And so essentially Credit Suisse, what happens at GAM is the first time it really goes wrong in a big way. And GAM has to close down its funds. This is like $10 billion fund, has to close down. And essentially he gets Credit Suisse to buy out the worst stuff. He just moves it into Credit Suisse. So, GAM gets to say, hey, we fixed this, we solved our problem, we cleared out the fund. But what nobody really knows is that it's just been shoveled off to another guy. It's just another bigger bank that's taken on the problems.
But again, I remember, again, when I was a lad, one of my first managers, pulled me into the office and told me that he told me the terminology finding a victim. And it's where, one bank offloads its problem to another bank. I mean, we're talking about, $200,000 loans here. We're not talking high finance. We're talking street level credit. And you've always got to be on the lookout for the previous financiers finding a victim. But are these subsequent financiers thinking that that this isn't what's happening? I mean,
well, I think back to your point about interest rates and how to make a return. I think what happens at Credit Suisse actually is it kind of there's a door opens and he goes in and there's a couple of kind of maybe fairly low level fund managers who see this as like a low risk, high return way to build a portfolio, which means their management fees go up, which means their bonuses go up. And so they just they're in. And once they're in, like the guy you talk to, again, it's like hard to admit you're wrong. And so at what point, I went to Credit Suisse and I told them, look, you've got a bunch of loans here that are to Lex's neighbor and to, the cousin of one of his top guys, and these are not loans that Credit Suisse ought to be making with other people's money. And their response was sort of like, yeah, but look at the returns. Look, the returns are steady. And my point was, well, they always will be, so long as the money keeps coming into the fund, because Lex is telling me that he's never having to acknowledge that these loans aren't being repaid. And so it's kind of staggering to me that the portfolio managers don't understand that. But I think the reality is they don't want to understand it, because, to acknowledge it is to sort of close down the fund, right? It's once you're in, it's get out.
Yeah, I guess to some extent, the last real recession, certainly in Australia, was 89, 90. In Australia anyway, the GFC, it was bad, but it wasn't the wipeout that it was. So you got generations almost of people who've never really seen bad times. And it really, and you're right. I mean, it really, you've called the book Pyramid of Lies. You've got the salesperson that Lex is pitching to. They want to make their bonus, and everybody. I guess it's a convenient sort of story for everybody up the chain, isn't it?
I think so. Nobody wants to rock the boat while the money's flowing in and everybody's making a return. Who wants to say, actually, at the bottom of this is a bunch of bad loans? And because that once you say it out loud, it's kind of over for everybody, right? And in the end, what happens really, the trigger for it happening is that there was a bunch of insurance that was supposed to sort of provide cover for these loans. In the end, it's really because an outsider, the insurance company says, we're not going to insure these things anymore. And so they all have to acknowledge that there's a bunch of loans that can't be repaid.
Right. So they're the little boy at the back of the crowd saying the emperor's got no clothes.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically. So now, one of the things we've touched on it, but he had this ambitious pursuit of fitting in with high society. He named the fund after himself. I suppose that's not unique, but I guess it's a portend of things to come. I mean, he had incredible personal drive. There's no doubt about that. I mean, do you have you seen this elsewhere? I mean, is this just human nature, or he seemed to have it just in extraordinary quantities?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely an incredibly hardworking guy, right? Even by the sort of standards of investment banking and that kind of world, he's incredibly hardworking. He definitely has, the ability to kind of pull. Like, he talks really well. He's a great salesman. He's got that ability to say things that kind of, you ask him a question, it's challenging, and he says something else, and you think, did that answer my question? Or, somehow we just shifted somewhere else, and I'm not sure if I got an answer there or not. So he's really good at that sort of stuff. The sort of, the ingratiating himself with the kind of high society, I think that is a really interesting element, because to some degree he does that because that's how you get money. Right. So having the private jets is not because having a fleet, he's got a fleet of private jets, right? Like Goldman Sachs has one, he's got a bunch of them. So having those is not, I think, about, luxury. It's not about kind of like, look how great I am. It's actually about sending a signal to investors that I am the real deal. It's about building a kind of credible scenario of who I am. So I think collecting.
Well, it's like you are who you say you are, I suppose.
Yeah,
if you say you're a guy with corporate jets flying around the world in $5,000 suits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then people believe it, and they start to give you money because why wouldn't you give that guy money? He's really successful. Look at his private jet collection.
Look, I mean, and the thing is, he seems to parlay one relationship into the next, and sort of, just goes up and up and up. Now, we had Julie Bishop, who was a minister in the Australian government here, and you mentioned her in your book. The other obvious one is David Cameron. I mean, the fact that he had a business card for Number 10 Downing Street. It reminds me of the movie Zelig. I don't know if you ever saw that Woody Allen movie Zelig. I mean, he was just everywhere. It is quite extraordinary. And, we've had this recent controversy in Australia with Qatar Airlines. The government's not letting Qatar Airlines take extra spots. And it's absolutely unrelated that, and it's not just one party or the other. The people in government, they give, Qantas gives them and their families members access to the chairman's lounge, which is all very nice, and I'm sure that's got no influence whatsoever. But he did get David Cameron in. I mean, how do you think that getting David Cameron in? I mean, was that like an inflection point?
I think it's really important for him, actually. I mean, it's a bizarre sort of series of circumstances that lead to him Lex getting into Downing Street. Essentially, post financial crisis, the UK government puts out commissions a report to look at ways to save money, and one of the things this report says is, we might look at supply chain finance. That could save us some money. And Lex is kind of an expert on supply chain finance. And there's a senior civil servant who he knows from his time at Morgan Stanley who says, why don't we invite Lex in to talk about this? And Lex, kind of being Lex, he kind of turns that into as you said, a number 10 Downing Street business card. And, he's hosting meetings in 10 Downing Street. There's a lot of kind of civil servants who are looking around going, who is this guy? What is he doing here? But Lex doesn't care. He's so thick-skinned, he just keeps going. And so, he gets to know David Cameron and so on. When Cameron then leaves office, this is kind of classic Lex smarts. He offers him a job. I think Cameron, why does he take it? That's interesting because I think, like all prime ministers, all ex-senior politicians take jobs in private companies when they leave, or public companies when they leave. But I guess I would think the only thing you've got to sell as a former prime minister is your credibility. That's why people want to hire you. So you would want to be really careful about the companies you lend that credibility to or you sell it to.
Yeah.
And he's kind of been a bit careless with his. And actually, I know some other senior politicians, really experienced senior politicians, spoke to Cameron and said, don't do it. Greensill's, a lot of problems, a lot of noise around Greensill, don't do it. And he went ahead and did it. And I think the reasons for that are, one, it was kind of cool. Cameron always likes to be a bit cooler than the crowd. So he's not going to work at BlackRock or JP Morgan. He's going to work at a fintech in theory. I think also the money on offer is just like exponentially or potentially exponentially higher, right? So you can earn, as an ex-politician, you could probably earn pretty good money, maybe $1 million, £1 million a year for advising BlackRock. Let's say, I'm making up the names, but at Greensill, if they'd IPO'd, he had potentially had stock that was going to be 60, 70 million pounds. So the money on offer is like jackpot money. So I think that those are the two reasons. It's cool and it's a lot of money. The third that I've heard from many people is Cameron's not known for his work ethic, and sort of going to a fintech once a month to the board meetings is relatively straightforward.
Well, we could go down a rabbit warren and ask, what is a fintech? And I know you touch on that. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of financiers, certainly in Australia, characterize themselves in recent years as fintechs because it's cool, and they get in. It sort of, I guess, adds a few figures to the multiple of the value of your business because you're a fintech. But just because you've got a computer in the back office doesn't necessarily make you a fintech. I
think it's interesting, actually, because I think that's kind of critical as well to Greensill, right? So I think he sees that fintechs get massive valuations, and so he wants to be called a fintech. When the reality is that most of the people there are using Excel spreadsheets. There's nothing techie about it. All the tech is outsourced to somebody else. There's nothing. It's just a small loans company, really. But he realizes that 4 or 5 years ago, especially, fintech valuations are going through the roof. So I want to be one. Why wouldn't you want to be one?
Yeah, and look, it's sort of everybody's. It's like everybody's kidding each other to some extent. He did make big use of those relationship with David Cameron. I mean, there's one scene you paint very vividly when they're in the desert. I can't remember who. What's his name? The three initials.
Muhammad bin Salman, so the leader of Saudi Arabia. So he uses. I mean, that's Cameron's main sort of the main thing he brings to Greensill is he's a door opener, right? So he
Yeah.
he goes to the meeting with SoftBank where they secure the money from SoftBank. He's introducing Lex to all sorts of political leaders around the world. That was that photo. There's this photo of Cameron and Lex sitting in the desert, and a source of mine sent it to me. And we were, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, we were really kind of cautious about using it because the main thing we were worried about was normally we can't print photos unless we know the copyright. We're worried that somebody's going to come and say, "Can you, hang on a minute, that's my photo. You owe me for it." In this case, sort of knew where it was coming from, and that person wouldn't come and ask us for the money. So the problem with that was then we couldn't own the photo either. So everybody's got that photo now. As soon as we published it, everybody else published it. But
now there's a part in your book where Greensill's just leaning on Cameron to make one phone call after the other to really just to get bailed out. One of the little things that intrigued me a little bit was the deal with the pharmacies in the UK. Like that, I just couldn't understand what the economic benefit there was. I mean, if the government wanted the pharmacies to have better cash flow, couldn't they just pay them sooner?
Yeah, well, you're dead right. So in the end, there was an audit done. This is the deal where essentially a bunch of UK pharmacies are going to be using Greensill as a supply chain finance business. So Greensill's going to pay is going to fund their supplier transactions. And in theory, the reason for doing it would be that it saves the pharmacies, the government some money. In reality, there's an audit done that shows it didn't save them anything. There's no benefit. What's good for Lex though in a deal like that, right? Again, is about building credibility, right? So he gets to say, I do finance work for the UK government or for the National Health Service. And he does deals like that over and over and over again, right? Where there isn't really any economic benefit even to him, but it gets a big brand name, on his website and means that he's building credibility.
Well, ditto the payroll thing. I can't remember the name of that product, but
well, there's a couple of free up is one. It's essentially you're sort of saying I'll pay. The theory of it is, when we work for a salary, we get paid at the end of 2 weeks or the end of a month, and so we're sort of lending credit to our employers, and so this idea is, these companies will provide the money up front to the employees and get it back later from the employers. And Lex was going to do that for nothing. He told me, I'm going to do that for nothing. I said to him, Lex, this is like a real conversation we had. I said, I don't understand why you would do it for nothing though, Lex. Like I can't understand why you would have a business that doesn't make any money. And he kind of looked at me and in a very Lex Greensill way was like, you just can't understand that I would do something because it's a good thing to do. I'm like, well, no, not really. I can't. You're a businessman. Why would you? That's just not what's happening here. And
well, of course, did the investors give him the money to give it away for free?
Yeah, exactly. It's not. I mean, that's part of it, right? Is actually it's not even really your money, right? It's you're doing this with other people's money. If he wants to be a philanthropist on the side, that's great. But he's all of this is other people's money. That's kind of critical as well, I think.
Now, part of the big story with Lex was that this thing about he was democratizing finance, which he made that sound like a crusade, and he told the story of, when he was on the farm and the big guys, screwing the farmers. And I mean, it's funny, you talk about the photo of him, sitting in the desert. I think when like on the front page of the Financial Review, there'd be Lex wearing the high-vis farm gear and the hat. I mean, I put that. It's all part of the mythology, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, he was very readily would trot out that story about growing up on the farm and his parents couldn't get paid on time. The grocery stores would pay them too late, and this was what was driving him to fix this problem of suppliers not getting paid on time. But I think you're right. It's all part of the mythology. It's a little bit like, some of the stuff you hear coming out of Silicon Valley, right? About like what's driving Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos or, some of the others. I think, in reality, democratizing finance, it's just not really what was happening there, right, at all. I mean, no. In the end, there was a report, an investigation, right, in Australia by the Small Business Ombudsman into supply chain finance, and it was very critical of a lot of supply chain finance programs because they were really bad for small businesses. Essentially, big buyers were able to say to their small suppliers, if you get on this program where you don't get paid as much, then we'll work with you. And if you don't get on the program, we won't work with you. And Greensill kind of plays this like cat and mouse dance with the small business ombudsman, where they're critical of Greensill. Then Greensill will kind of fix the problem that they're being criticized for, and then proclaim that they're doing the right thing. And it's like, well, you are, but only because you've been told to do the right thing because you were doing before that.
I mean, you got caught. That's what went. That's what went wrong. You got caught.
I mean, I kind of liken it to like my kids. When my kids do something wrong and the room's a mess, and they tidy it up and say, "Look how tidy my room is." And it's like, well, only because I caught you.
They're doing something wrong because they think you're asleep, and you catch them. They go, "Well, I thought you were asleep." Well, no, exactly. you were doing the wrong thing. The fact that you thought I was asleep's got nothing to do with it. I mean, it's interesting that that at one stage, while he was sort of riding the wave, there were these large companies, and I'm just relating to my own experience in Australia. All of a sudden they were getting into supply chain finance, and in fact, it was impinging on our market. They were reverse factoring. We're sort of factoring in the other direction, and we certainly saw it affecting our business. But then those large companies, after that ombudsman investigation, they started pulling out of it. But I think there are still the echoes of it, where I know, for example, supermarkets that used to religiously pay their suppliers 30 days, they're extending terms to 90 days in some cases, and holding that same gun to the head of the suppliers, saying, well, we'll pay you sooner, but you just got to give us bigger discounts. So now I know that's always gone on, but I'm just seeing more of it now, and I just wonder whether or not it's a legacy of all of that.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's there's legitimate supply chain finance, right? Like I don't want to knock that as an entire industry. It's a legitimate tool for lending to businesses and sort of greasing the wheels of business. But I think it has been applied. Clearly, it has been applied in a way that is not good for small businesses. That's kind of predatory in a way, and I think some of that's still going on. I mean, there's a sort of a move to make the accounting of it more transparent. Certainly in the US, the accounting rules have been tightened up so that companies that use supply chain finance have to disclose a little bit more about it. But yeah, I think it's definitely worth keeping an eye on.
And the other thing is that the people that are providing the supply chain finance at the level that Greensill was, they're the Citibanks. I wouldn't take on Citibank, because I don't have the cost of capital that they do, right? So to compete in that space, particularly if you're going to be providing supply chain finance to, global corporations, you've got to have an extremely low cost of capital. Now Greensill started, he obviously there's a whole relationship with Gupta, and even though it was branded, the packet said supply chain finance, but really most of the business was, corporate finance. And it was corporate finance that nobody else was prepared to do.
Yeah, exactly.
So the business model was flawed.
Yeah, totally. In a nutshell. So I think you're right. Like the cost of capital issue is really important, right? And what he's saying is, I mean, he doesn't even have any balance sheet, right? So he's saying, I'm going to get the funding from somebody else. So I'm going to GAM or Credit Suisse and saying, you get your clients to give me the money, and I'll do this supply chain finance and compete with Citigroup and others. The challenge then is, right, like how out of this business, which has really small margins, and Citi only does it for certain clients, how out of those small margins are you supposed to pay the investors in the Credit Suisse fund, Lex Greensill, Credit Suisse's fund managers, and you've got insurance on top of it, because often dealing with sort of lower credit borrowers, you got to pay that as well. So you got to get all of this out, squeeze all of this out of these tiny margins, and yet he somehow was doing this, at a lower cost than Citi. Well, the answer to that is because he's doing it at a loss. On the big clients, he's doing it he is doing supply chain finance, but he's doing it at either zero profit or a loss. And then because that business is not making any money, he's having to do this other business, which is, as you say, corporate finance to borrowers who otherwise wouldn't get the money. And that's like high risk. That is the opposite of supply chain finance. It's not low risk multi-transactions. It's high risk one-off transactions. And then you sort of jamming them all together in a supply chain finance fund in a way that means the investors, the ultimate end investors, Credit Suisse's clients, think they bought something which is, financing Coca-Cola paying thousands of suppliers for widgets. But in fact, most of the money in those funds is being generated by, loans to Sanjeev Gupta for his purchase of a steel plant, or loans to Lex's neighbor to set up a school for people with special needs, or whatever it is. Right. Loans to a friend of his who never pays it back, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there's another small, there's a small scale one of these in Australia that's very interesting. I mean, one of the great things, in my business, we're a fund, we're governed. Well, we have to report to the Australian Security and Investment Commission, but we're not listed, and we don't report public data, and so I'm not under pressure. If we're having, like, COVID was bad for us because we were competing with the tax office and all of those government support schemes. And so, we just said to our investors, look, things are a little bit lean at the moment. But if I was a public company or a fund that had to keep, they have to keep growing, they have to keep the dividends going, you start chasing those deals. I had a friend years ago that had a mortgage fund, and they were just doing commercial loans. But then there wasn't, that business, it was, they weren't getting the yields. Their book was getting, the next thing they're getting into property development, well, which is high risk. And they went bust. Look, I'm conscious that I am running out of time, and you've been very generous to make time for us. So I'm just going to sort of get to my last couple of questions. My first question is there anything else that you're working on at the moment?
I'm actually working on a book about Credit Suisse at the moment. What happened there? Obviously, my sort of Greensill stuff gave me some insight, and so I'm using that as a kicking off point to look at what happened there. Yeah.
Wow. And are you making a few enemies along the way?
Whenever you write about things that are like bad things that happen to people, I guess you make some enemies. But that's not the objective. Honestly, it's sort of I'm as I say, I was a chartered accountant. I worked in finance. I'm a financial journalist. I'm kind of really interested in the truth, really interested in why things go wrong. Like I don't think we're, as you said, these things keep happening over and over and over again. So I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where you kind of solve them. But maybe by shining a light on problems, you can sort of help people avoid them, those who want to avoid.
And they're all very human stories at the end of the day as well. I mean, this one in particular, the Greensill story, I mean, I'm not sure where I'd be interested to see what happens with Credit Suisse. But there's, as I say, all the elements of Greek tragedy are there, and these are problems with the human condition going back thousands of years. We've seen The Big Short. There's been, that was a great movie. There was Boiler Room, Wall Street, Wall Street, and The Wolf of Wall Street. If Pyramid of Lies was made into a movie, who's going to play Lex Greensill?
That's a really good question. I mean, I really think that it would be a great musical. They made a musical out of Enron. I'd kind of love to see it be made into a musical. I think the sort of absurdity of certain elements of it would really feature well. So, just thinking of where you guys are, maybe Hugh Jackman would be a good, he'd have the charisma, he can sing, right? And he'd pull it off. Lex would probably like that as well, by the way.
Oh, I bet he would. And what about, and who's playing Duncan Mavin?
Well, that's a much tougher question, and one I'm not super comfortable with. I was thinking about this, once. I've been thinking about whether this is going to make it onto screen or something. But maybe somebody more like a Gary Oldman, cynical. Somebody can sort of portray a slightly cynical mood.
Wow. I mean, you've shot high there. I mean, he was Winston Churchill, wasn't he? And of course, Commissioner Gordon in the Batman movie. So yeah, that'd be wonderful. All right, listen, I'm really super grateful. I am going to ask you one question. I don't know if it's a question for off air or on air. I have had requests for autographed books. So do I send you books? How does that work? Do I buy books and mail them to you, or? Well, you know what? Let's do that by email. I'll email you, and you tell me if I get a bunch of your books delivered somewhere in London, we'll work that out. But particularly a couple of the ex Greensill employees were really keen on that.
Okay. So, well, I mean, if you want to put me in touch with them directly, I'm still keen to talk to them.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm sure some of them are watching this, so I will definitely do that for you. Definitely. All right. Well, Duncan, it's been wonderful, and I'm just knocked out that you agreed to do this. So thank you very much, and yeah, good luck with the next one.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Cheers.